Hello everyone. This is part of the Debaters Council series where we break down motions at recently held tournaments to help you understand and comprehend this motion and similar motions and do better in the future. So today I'll be breaking down the quarterfinals motion of the Dr. NM Perera Debating Championship 2024 organized by Ananda College. But before we move into that, just a small introduction about myself. I'm Shakeeb. I was a debater for Wesley College and I'm the current head coach of Mahamaya College, Kandy. Today, I'll be breaking down the quarterfinals motion of NMPs, and that states rather, during times of economic crisis, this house believes that it is better to live in an autocracy than in a democracy. So let's move into framing for this debate. So let's look at what prop really needs to say or how prop should set up this debate. So the first question that I hypothetically come up with is, in an economic crisis, what is the general population state of mind? And before that, what are the characteristics of an economic crisis? So what can we see, what harms can we see during an economic crisis? In an economic crisis, you usually see things like people being paid less, lower wages, layoffs from jobs, especially in private companies and in the government sector as well. You see higher taxes, for example, like the VAT in Sri Lanka, the 18% and higher on some things. The lack of food due to the cutoff of imports of certain essential goods, and in some cases a fuel crisis because of our lack of funding or money to be able to get fuel shipments to the country. So these are the things these are the harms that are usually seen in an economic crisis. The other question is, who is affected by this the most and what are the consequences of that? So generally, in a motion like this and in an economic crisis, the people who are generally going to get affected are the middle class and people in poverty. They are the ones who are going to be most affected by this. Sure, the richest of the rich may be affected by this comparatively, but the effect on them is very marginal or minimal compared to the suffering that these other two stakeholders go through, because generally rich people have contingency plans and other ways to escape an economic crisis, right? So the people who are most affected are the middle class and the people in poverty. Now, what would their state of mind or what would their psyche be in an economic crisis? Generally, when people are going through all of these things, all of these harms that I mentioned before, they are most likely going to be in a very emotionally vulnerable state, right? Because at this point, it is fair to assume that these people won't have the cost calculus to comprehend and make good decisions. Why? Because of the fact they're going to be irrational because they're emotional and they don't, their suffering is preventing them from understanding any complex nuances of situations. People are generally going to care about their suffering at this point, which as proposition you have to sort of characterize as a harmful thing. But I mean, that framing is not going to be challenged by opposition because that helps their case as well, right? So they're likely not going to challenge that that part of your framing. The second thing that you need to frame in this debate is how influential media is, right? One, you can say that social perception is affected by media, and what people perceive and the way people think is heavily influenced by what the media tells them. For example, if you only watched an anti-government news channel, they would always paint or let's say the government is left wing and you only watch a right-wing news channel, it's likely to paint the government in a negative light, and you would formulate your opinion based on what you see, because the common average individual isn't going to necessarily go out and search for different sources of information, and they're likely to just consume what the media tells them, and that is a bad thing, right? Then after that, after you set up how influential the media is, you can then concede to the fact that in an autocracy, it is likely that there is going to be a certain level of media suppression. But what you're going to uniquely prove in this debate is that media suppression that occurs in an autocracy, in an economic crisis, is essentially going to be a good thing and not a bad thing. And you have to prove that, throughout all three of your speeches, right? Now, why would media suppression work in an autocracy? If you think about it, an autocratic government already has structures in place to suppress the media at any time, right? And they anyway have it, because then autocracy. And in these countries, people are less likely to question these things, because people are indoctrinated from a very, very young age to believe that these dictators are like, divine figures who and are made to think that, these people are made to think that these divine figures are going to, make all their decisions for the benefit of the country, or basically, they're going to be patriotic about what they do, right? All of what they do is for the benefit of the country. This is what people are, forced to grow up with or indoctrinated with in countries like this. So you say that media suppression is going to work in these countries. So in your framing, what you can do is sort of to try and justify that this media suppression is a good thing in an autocratic country, because it's going to lessen any chaos that would be created in this period, right? Because what happens in a democracy during an economic crisis is, like I said, since people are emotional and irrational in this period of time, this is what causes things like riots, violence, chaos, looting, and things like mass protests, which may get violent, right? So you say that in an autocratic government, all of these things are curbed because of media suppression, because people, don't necessarily see the problem. And you also, the last thing that you can concede to is that, that there will be short-term harm, right? You say that, yes, in an autocratic government, there is a short-term harm, but you say that in an autocratic government, it is much easier to solve the crisis faster, and that this debate is about who solves the crisis faster and who protects the most socio-economically vulnerable people. So what are the arguments that you can run in a debate like this? I've come up with two for the proposition. So the first argument would be how on prop you have greater socio-economic and political stability as an autocracy. So, but first, I want to characterize the harms on opposition in a democracy in an economic crisis, and why that is uniquely harmful. Right? In an economic crisis, like we characterized before, that people are vulnerable. If you allow people to, you have actors like unions, opposition parties, and the poorest of the poorest actively, taking to the streets and antagonizing the government and trying to take down the government. You can see, mass protests, you can see violence, you can, there's a lot of violence that is going to happen in this period, right? Because, like I said before, people can't see the bigger picture. So why is this, uniquely harmful? Because on opposition, what politicians and parties who are running for office are going to do is they're going to try and use this to, to their own advantage, to better their own campaigns. Because politicians aren't benevolent, right? They want power. And what populists are going to do is they're going to put out the ideal rhetoric for these people in this vulnerable period, and they make false promises and provide, temporary blanket solutions to people. Because, again, people are irrational, and people are likely going to buy into this rhetoric because of that reason. But on opposition in a democracy, since election cycles are, within a very short time frame, they have more incentives to make short-term policies, which is likely going to be even more exploitative and exploit the most vulnerable people in the country. That would mean, since the short-termist policies would be like Sri Lanka introducing a very crazy high, VAT and taxation, which seriously affects the poorest of the poor, and the longer working hours with less pay and bad labor conditions are some examples of how the most vulnerable people are exploited because of short-termist policies, because the government's incentive is to increase production as fast as possible to show that they can make progress so that they'll get elected in the next election cycle, which is very harmful to these vulnerable individuals. But on proposition side, what is the unique benefit? In an autocratic society with media control and the controlling and stopping of protests and stuff using law enforcement, you have a couple of unique benefits. One, because people don't have the necessary information to make decisions out of fear. This is going to reduce things like panic buying, and that would reduce the shortage of already limited resources in the country. Two, less people are going to pull out from banks. Sure, there'll be some smart people still who will understand what the government is trying to do and will pull out of banks, but a large percentage of the population won't have the knowledge to pull out of banks, which keeps our purchasing power the same and reduces the inevitable inflation that's going to come. So sure, inflation will still happen, but it will be significantly less on in an autocracy, because you'll have less people who are going to pull out of banks, because they don't the media is suppressed in these countries. So which then as an impact leads to less chaos and less violence on the streets, which is again a unique benefit of the proposition. And that is basically the first argument that you can run. The second argument I have for the proposition is, what are the incentives of autocratic leaders, and why these autocratic leaders and autocratic countries will still gain international support? So let's look at what are the incentives, or what is the psyche of an autocratic leader. An autocratic leader craves popularity. They want to be remembered forever. They want to create legacy, and they want to leave that behind. They want their power to last for their entire lifetime, and they want the offspring and generations to come to hold that power as well. So what are they likely to do? To stay in power and to prevent any sort of uprising by the people, they have more incentive to create good policies. Because to an autocratic leader, their power depends on how much people trust them. And they know this and they fear this, because throughout history we see that almost all absolute monarchies failed or were overthrown via revolutions and uprisings, because people were upset with how the person with absolute power treated them. And right now, autocratic leaders understand this very well, and they know that if they do something extreme and that people are against them and people don't trust them anymore, that this could lead to revolt, and this could lead to the tarnishing of their legacy and their power. So they're likely to have more incentive to create good policies. For example, autocratic societies like China and Russia are still some of the world's largest economies, right? With a great GDP per capita and development, despite being autocratic. Because even still, dictators have an incentive to keep people happy, otherwise they will be overthrown. The other incentive that they have is to exploit or to gain as much wealth as possible. They need to develop that country, right? So in order, even for their own person, even if they're acting in their own self-interest, this country will be developed well, and the people will be kept happy, so that they can acquire things for their selfish reasons. So these are the two unique incentives that autocratic leaders have. Now I'm going to go to the second part of this argument and how these autocratic leaders will still gain international support. Sure, there are going to be some self-righteous countries like the USA or like big democratic superpowers who might not give autocratic countries loans and impose sanctions on them. But uniquely, this will not really affect them, because they will still receive support from other autocratic nations. For example, how Russia, China, and Belarus uniquely and constantly support each other by giving them loans and sharing technology and all of those things, because they have an incentive to unite and to keep up with against other democratic countries, so they uniquely work together. So that's still going to receive support. And you can see pragmatically countries like Russia, China, and Belarus are doing completely fine, even with the hundreds of sanctions that are imposed against them by democratic superpowers. So this is so the idea that there won't be international support during these times of economic crisis is not true. So why is this comparatively better in an economic crisis? Because the IMF and World Bank generally, and the Asian Bank, have all very difficult, sometimes unreasonably high prerequisites to acquire money, and it takes quite a long time. So within that huge time frame, let's say at least 6 months to an year at the very minimum, in that period of time, the people in this country are going to suffer in a democracy. But uniquely, autocratic countries can get loans much faster from other autocratic governments because of their incentive to support each other, which means that autocratic countries can actually solve this crisis faster. That's why on the proposition you say as your ultimatum that you're uniquely better. One, you have less chaos and violence because of the media suppression structures during economic crisis, and two, you have far greater socio-economic stability and accountability on your side. And those are the main pushes that you can make as the proposition. So what kind of arguments can you run for the opposition in this debate? But before I move on into the arguments, what framing do you have to do for opposition? In terms of characterization, you don't have to recharacterize the debate in any huge way. All you need to prove is that all of the things that proposition mentions in their framing, like media suppression and all of those things, are actually a very harmful thing. But that comes more as a response and can be integrated into your arguments as well, which I am going to be doing in this video. And I'm not going to get into the detailed responses because it can vary from debate to debate and it's not a constant thing. So moving on into the first argument that I made for prop on how it's much worse for the vulnerable stakeholder in a democracy and a lack of accountability in autocratic governments. The first question that you push onto proposition is to question them on who make sure that these checking mechanisms in place. Are there any checking mechanisms in place? And who are the people who looks into them, right? Because ideally, the things that keep a democracy in check are things like protest, are things like the fear of riots and all of those things, and the fear of being overthrown, or like fear of people, having an aragale against you, is what keeps these politicians in check. But who keeps a dictator or an autocratic leader in check? Right? You push that burden onto the proposition because it is even compounded in autocracy with things like media suppression and dispersion of stopping of protests. Because what an autocratic leader can just do is to beat up all the people who come for a protest and send them home and not publish it on the media, so the wider society doesn't know that a protest like that happened. So there is no accountability mechanism that takes place, and also these countries generally refuse things like third-party accountability organizations like Amnesty to come into their country and audit these places and what really goes on. So you really don't have a solid checking mechanism in place in an autocratic country. What are the consequences? In an economic crisis, things are uniquely worse for the most vulnerable stakeholder in an autocracy, because dictators have an incentive to look good. So what they're going to do, like proposition will probably concede, is that that dictators want to look good, right? So dictators will want to increase production to a maximum to look better than normal and to hide the actual problem that's going on by using this illusion of development, using this sort of illusion of development, right? So what's going to happen is that they are likely to use the lowest wage workers and the blue collar workers to make this happen, and uniquely they're going to try to increase production to a maximum in an economic crisis. So worker exploitation, or the risk of worker exploitation in an autocracy, is far higher, because at the end of the day, dictators aren't benevolent people. They care about themselves and their families. They'll do anything to obtain personal wealth and resources, but they have less incentive to help other people. So if developing the country and making everything seem normal will make them look good, they're going to try to do that to stay in power. Otherwise, they're going to be usurped, right? So that is likely what's going to happen, right? So let's assume, even if these autocratic leaders or dictators are going to be benevolent individuals, it is likely that other people in this system will use these people as pawns, because benevolence is a good indicator of righteousness and the ability of people to forgive those around them, and those qualities are easily exploitable by smart people in the system. So even if you have a benevolent autocratic leader who genuinely wants to do their best for their people, the other people in this system are likely to exploit that person for their goodness and completely exploit the system anyways. So why democracy is uniquely better? Because one, political parties need to put out good candidates to continue to stay in power or for longevity, because so in that crisis they're less likely to do anything crazy or anything extreme, or they're going to be less extreme than a dictator, because if they do something extreme, they will definitely not get elected. Why? Because in a democracy, you have media scrutiny, you have backlash, you have protests, you have opposition parties vocally advocating against you. So if you do something wrong in this period of time, you're definitely not going to get re-elected, right? Because the opposition parties and the people are the only thing keeping the government in check, and they're going to make sure that the government ups their game. So if they do not up their game, they're going to lose out on the next election. This is not what the political parties want. This is against the incentive, right? And in a democracy, even the average individual uniquely has the right even to sue the president if they are being cruel. But that unique benefit does not exist in an autocracy. So if the average individual tries to hold the president accountable in courts, well, that's not going to end very well for them or their families. They're probably going to get to mysteriously shoot themselves twice and commit suicide. So yeah, that's a likely comparative. So then you have to characterize why things like riots and uprisings are much worse on the proposition. Because if you look at it, even if people can't see the impacts in the media, they can still feel the impacts of an economic crisis, right? Especially in an economic crisis, because suddenly their employers are going to start paying them half the amount, right? Suddenly, if companies say we can't afford to pay you anymore, you're not important enough to us, and they lay you off, that's also going to affect you because you're not going to be able to get a job, right? When products become uniquely very, very expensive because of value-added tax for basic food and healthcare, sure, right? On opposition, we can concede that most people will initially feel apathetic or scared to go and fight against the government. But there are brave people that exist in democracies. In autocracies, right? Rather, we are talking about the comparative here on up. There are brave people who exist even in autocracies. So these sort of people are the ones that will mobilize and start fighting. And after they start fighting, they're going to start pulling people who are on the fence, who are not convinced yet, and they pull them. They grow in numbers. They unite and cause chaos in these autocratic countries, right? And this is basically how almost all revolutions started. And all these revolutions and uprisings killed millions of people, displaced millions of people, and caused unprecedented, infrastructure and socio-economic damage, right? Especially to the most vulnerable person. And that is much, much worse on the opposition side, because you have media suppression, and people are going to only act on their feelings, and when they don't have media to consume, and when they don't have different opinions or discourse that exist in media to actually understand the struggles that the government might be going through and what the government is doing to solve the crisis. Because if you ignore, or if you whitewash that a crisis actually existed, people are likely to act on the emotions that they are feeling, and that is much worse, because it could lead to things like revolutions, which is harmful to the average individual. The second thing you can run is not necessarily an argument for opposition, but a principle that you'll have to integrate in your case, right? And the burden that you're going to push on proposition. So you can see that even if hypothetically solves this problem fast on their side, prop has to justify why it is okay to exploit millions of people, especially the most vulnerable stakeholder, in a time of crisis, especially when they aren't the reason for the crisis, which is what is going to happen in an autocracy, right? And in an autocracy, no one is going to take that into account. In democracy, uniquely, the unique benefit is that you have the social contract and you have accountability mechanisms that don't exist, and which you have proved on the opposition side, that will less likely lessen the impact on the most vulnerable stakeholder and solve the crisis faster, right? So the third thing that you have to do, and the final thing, is again not necessarily this is the only response that I'm going to be integrating, because it's likely to come in the debate, in a fairly good debate. So about the international support argument. So prop obviously makes the claim that autocratic countries can get international support, yes, via other autocratic countries, but you try to find the flaw in logic there, because the point is, you can get support, sure, but how much exactly, right? Because a country like Russia isn't going to be handing you their entire GDP to solve the economic crisis, right? And when in an economic crisis, you are billions of dollars in debt and billions of dollars in deficits, right? So that's not how. So from like Russia and China, the max you're getting is hypothetically about like 100 to 200 million dollars. That is not going to be enough to solve your crisis. So in an autocratic country, sure, you will get some level of funding, but in comparison to your populations and comparison to your needs, that is still not enough at all for you to solve the crisis. And because of all these sanctions against you by democratic superpowers and the hatred that they have against you, they're likely not to give you loans as well. And that is going to, and being an autocracy is uniquely harmful to the people, because they are not able to get enough financial support to pull their country out of an economic crisis ever. So that is the unique harm that you say, that the response you give to the international support argument brought out by the proposition. And yeah, that is pretty much it for this video. I hope that I was clear and you learned something. And yeah, thank you very much for watching.